Hello, everyone. Before getting into today's episode, I'm going to read two listener reviews. First is from listener Zealous Number One, and the title of the review is Informative slash Valuable. It says, really enjoy listening to this podcast, learning a lot about EdTech that I can use in my own teaching practice. And one more. This one's from Dad the Best I Can. That is another podcast hosted by Rob Roseman. Definitely recommend you check out Rob's show. And this title of the review is Gerard Knows. It says Gerard knows EdTech, email, and marketing better than anyone. Don't agree, but I appreciate your kind words, Rob. It says he cuts right to the point and every episode delivers actionable nuggets. So there are two reviews. Of course, I really appreciate people taking the time to write those, and also it will help more people listen to the show. So, in your podcast player, if you can leave a rating and a review, I will greatly appreciate it, and I will read it on an upcoming episode. So, now we'll get right to today's episode with Jessica Millstone, the Queen of New York City EdTech. Hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone. This is the EdTech Startup Show. I'm your host, Gerard Dawson. And tonight, I'm very happy to be on the line with Jessica Millstone. Jessica is a leader in New York City's EdTech community. She's an investor in early stage tech companies, and she's an expert on parenting in the digital age, which is, for any other parents listening, something we certainly could use more of. So I'm really excited to talk to Jessica tonight because she has a broad range of interesting experiences, both past and current, and I know we'll have a lot of good stuff to talk about. So Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Gerard, for having me tonight. I appreciate it.
Sure. So I know we've spoken a little bit before, and I know kind of what you're up to and what you've done in the past, but for folks who maybe are not familiar with your work, how would you describe basically what you're working on now and what's led up to what you're doing today?
Great, thank you. Well, like any good Gen Xer, I'm a real generalist. And so I've worked in education for over 25 years now, and I've done a lot of different things within that. I've been a classroom teacher, I've been a professor at a teacher's college. I've worked in product design, user research, academic research. And I would say that the common thread through all of that is that I've just really tried to develop an expertise around the audience of teachers, of educators of all kinds using technology for learning. And so after about 5 years in the product development space, I decided to make the leap into investing. And I'm in the process of launching an investment fund that's all centered around women-led technology companies, primarily in the education and sort of family learning space. And so that's just been a really exciting way for me to merge some of the professional work that I've done, working with teachers and with entrepreneurs. Also through my work with the New York EdTech Meetup, I've been the organizer of that almost 9,000 person member organization now for about 4.5 years. And, just really been really active in the New York EdTech space for even longer than that. So I'm really excited to merge a lot of the work that I've done professionally with just my natural love of meeting people and helping women get started in their careers, in their industries, and giving them a little seed capital to get started.
Cool. Yeah, well, first, congratulations on the new venture. And I think it's both interesting, timely, exciting to have a really specific focus for the companies that you're investing on that all relate to your past interests and experience. So that's really what, as I was preparing to talk to you, I noticed, and this is something that I'm always excited about when I prepare to talk to a guest, is that I feel like your work and your mission, I'm not sure if you would call it that, but it's very cohesive. So I see a lot of similar themes and ideas that have come across the things you've talked about, things you've researched, things you've worked on. So one of those that stuck out to me as a parent with young kids who wants to educate them and also just have fun with them, and also as a teacher of high school kids, is your interest around games and learning.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious just a little bit about how you got into that, and also specifically what do you think makes for a good learning game?
Oh yeah, this is like one of my, I'm one of the most passionate advocates of using games for learning. And I feel very lucky I had the opportunity to, during some of my years as a professor at Bank Street College, I had the opportunity to do some original research around the use of video games, digital games in the classroom. As a kind of student of progressive education and working in progressive schools for a long time, I always had noticed how the really great teachers always used games to teach something, whether it was board games or card games or role play games. Like there was always that element of, you know, really engaging kids in a fun way to learn about some really tough topics oftentimes. And even when I was doing this research, even upon reflection, I realized that my favorite teachers, in fact, were using integrating games into the classroom, you know, from the earliest ages. So one of the things I looked at was what's the 21st century version of that, of how teachers can use games to teach, and students can use games to really learn and remember, really like integrate the learning into their actual lives. And I had the opportunity to work really closely with a teacher named Joel Levin, who had been pioneering the use of Minecraft in the classroom up on the Upper West Side here in New York, and did a research project that was funded by BrainPOP, which I later went on to work for, but also was done through the Joan Ganz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop. So really taking some of the really great minds working in kids media and children's digital learning media products, and figuring out like what were the elements of games that what were the elements of these digital games that really promoted the best learning. So I would just say, like in a sentence, one of the things we realized right away was that if the mechanic of the game, like the way you play the game, has a relationship to the learning outcomes, to the objectives that you're trying to get to, that's the secret sauce of making a really great learning game. So we always, when I was doing my research and I met teachers that were really successful at integrating these into their classroom, and then later at BrainPOP when we were vetting games that we would bring onto our platform that were created by sometimes teachers or nonprofits, sometimes independent game developers, sometimes big game developers. That's really the area that we would look for, that matrix, that crossover of the learning objective and the game mechanic. And you know, it's a little bit of like, you know it when you see it, and actually it's really, you know it when the kid plays it, because you can see what their engagement level is like and how much they're getting out of it. So that became sort of the criteria for us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I
So
mean, I can give you an example of like
sure.
one suite of learning games that we really that I think is really exceptional is the iCivics games from, it's a nonprofit group out of Washington, D.C. They're originally founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and a group of educators who were interested in extending civics education. And this predates, you know, our current political situation in the US or anything, but really noticing that kids were not getting great civics education in specifically middle school, and decided to create a suite of games to sort of get to many things that were previously introduced just by a textbook or some multiple choice quizzes or something. And they came up with these games, and some of the mechanics in them are around argument or around discourse or around allocation of budgets or funds. So like the sort of way that you play the game really corresponds to the kind of, you know, principles, learning principles that you're trying to get across.
Got it. So,
And actually fun, great animation and, you know,
mhm,
really engaging.
sure. So, for example, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, if you're working on a game that's teaching budgeting or allocation, like you mentioned, where you would be maybe physically moving stacks of pretend money into different piles, is that
Yeah,
along the
the way that theirs works is, I mean, this is like one specific game around budgeting, and you really get like a big pot of money, and you have to
Mhm.
kind of like make sure that certain services are kept up in the town that you're in, and it's more like a local government scenario game. And then there's another one called Win the White House, which is also about like politics, like really like what makes a great campaign speech, what are campaign promises versus delivery. A lot of the elements of civics education and civil discourse kind of like are brought out through the mechanics of the game.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great. I mean, I will say that was such a rewarding experience to do the research. And I mean, if anybody's interested to see some of these games on BrainPOP, they have a game portal called Game Up that is actually sort of outside the subscription and available for people to play all of the games that they bring onto their platform. So it's a great way to see what kind of vetted learning game collection looks like. And it's so I always recommend that to people, whether they're BrainPOP users or not. You can still access it.
Right. Okay. So that was Game Up you mentioned, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Mhm.
brainpop.com/games.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll share that link when
Yeah.
we publish the episode. So that's fascinating. It also makes sense, but it's good to see those things that we might intuit supported by research. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that led me into something else I wanted to ask you about, which you alluded to, which is research. So I know
Mm-hmm.
you worked with a program related to or working with Sesame Workshop,
Mm-hmm.
and basically I'm curious about how you view the role of research in developing edtech products, whether they're games or not, because I know you and I both, maybe probably even more so you, but talk to a lot of education entrepreneurs. And at times it seems like people are building products off of more or less a hunch or something that they want to make.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not always the best idea, but other people have really dove into speaking to teachers. The irony that I said spoking there is is not lost on me. But then also you can develop a product really based on existing or new educational research. So can you talk a little bit about your experience with research and how you see that as a necessary component or just a nice additional bonus to product development?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that actually gets to one of the interesting sort of dichotomies around ed tech, where some of ed tech is created to solve a problem. That there's a problem that a teacher has, there's a problem that a school has, there's pain points for parents or students or any of the many stakeholders that are in the education ecosystem. And a lot of the ed tech products that you see are just created to solve that problem. They're not necessarily trying to hit a particular learning objective or or improve learning in a certain way, but they're trying to improve the lives of students and teachers and schools, but not necessarily trying to improve learning. So those products, I would say that they really should incorporate a good deal of user research, usability, really thinking about the people who are going to be engaging with the product and how does that solve a problem for them, and really listening to those people and incorporating that feedback into their products. And then there's what I think you're more getting at, which is what is the sort of learning science behind some of the products that are being made specifically for students to be using in order to like increase learning and achievement. And that is, it's such a tricky area. And I think the most important place, like where is really where research can play the biggest role. And I, I mean, there's many games, for example, when you were talking earlier about learning games, like there are some games that are based on true learning science and some that are just based on engagement and fun and, communicating a certain amount of information or content to a student, not necessarily trying to like get them to the next level of math or science or literacy in some way. So, and I wouldn't say that I am an expert on this at all, but I am very interested in sort of some of the new metrics that are being developed around efficacy, basically. Like, is this product that's been created, is it connected to evidence-based research, and is it actually effective at doing what it says it's doing? And I really support the initiatives that are out there doing that. There's one, I believe it's called the Jefferson Collective, based out of California, and really just trying to like come to some consensus on like what is efficacy around these EdTech products. And I think that where it's all going is really helping schools make decisions about what they're going to bring into the classroom and what they're not. I mean, in order to get federal funding for the purchase of an EdTech product, you really are supposed to show that it's has a research component to it, that it's really based on research of some sort, good research. But the actual accountability around that is a little fuzzy. So I think, just in terms of EdTech companies, big school districts, US Department of Education, everybody sort of coming together to some consensus around what would be efficacy standards, that would be the most productive, I think, towards that. But I know just on the level of the developers, for example, like I talked to a lot of game developers who their work is truly based on research, academic research that's been done at the best universities, and they can really prove their connection to learning. But they're kind of right now, they're really on the same playing field as like any product who might make a claim to getting a kid to do better at math or better at, have increased literacy rates, and there's no real standard around that. It's really, and then, it also comes down to teacher experience. Teachers are the best judges in some way of like what is learning. And so the more teachers are involved with the decisions on the EdTech products that come in the classroom, I think that's also a true metric of efficacy. Like a teacher can really tell if this is something that's pushing the needle and getting kids to a higher level of learning than whatever they were doing before. That's going to be like, to me, the real standard.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess research can always does happen in a specific context with certain inevitable biases perhaps built in, but then I agree with that. The practical application is kind of the ultimate litmus test.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of combining theory and practice together. Yeah. I mean, it's actually one area in which it was so frustrating in some ways to work with games for learning, because we did have great research around it, but implementation of digital games in the classroom is really challenging. There's a lot of, everyday behavior that you have to intercede on in order to get a teacher to use a game instead of a book, or have a school honor, a game as the final assessment for learning. Like there's a lot of behavioral hurdles to conquer around that. And we're seeing that as well. Like, just to switch over a little bit to some of the work I'm doing now, mentoring young entrepreneurs. A lot of my work has always been, when I work with teachers in the classroom, has always been around emerging technologies. I mean, at one point that was like CD-ROMs and websites, and now it's VR and AR. And we see the same hurdle. Like I'm seeing, it's a very similar situation that I'm seeing in the classroom, where there's, a few champion teachers who really are in there making headway and trying new technologies and using them to really replace other modalities that they were using in the classroom, and doing their own kind of A/B testing and seeing like which worked better than the other. And so there's like all these champion teachers that are using VR and AR in that way, but there's still the hurdles of like school implementation and of course hardware and cost, professional development, resources, all of those things, that ends up being a very significant piece of it, of whether a new technology will take hold in a school or not.
Right. And then just to even add on to that list, there's the pedagogical question of how do we fit this into our existing everyday type. For example, I remember just from a past episode, I spoke to Clarence Tan, who has a company called Bottle Learning, and it reminded me of some of the ideas you're talking about, because his game is specifically for formative assessment. So I kind of find it interesting now as games are able to take on different pieces of the stages of learning or different parts of a lesson. Just a related thought that comes up for me there. We did have, as I mentioned to you before, some very passionate and inspired listener questions. So would you be open for answering one of the related questions that I have?
Definitely. I was excited to see so many people chime in on LinkedIn there. Shout out hello to all of you.
Yeah. So one that just relates to this idea of, design, games, and being the architect of a learning experience is from Brandon Goon, who's the CEO of Be Anything. I know you know Brandon from New York EdTech Meetup,
yeah,
right?
Definitely.
So Brandon asked or said, UX designers and teachers are both choice architects. I'd love to know how Jessica has used her experience in both contexts to benefit her work.
That's a really interesting question. And Brandon, I don't think I would have put those two things together as both teachers, both being, architects in a way, in that sense. But one thing that both, working in UX and, hearing from users, customers, whether they're teachers or students or whoever is the person on the other end of the line, and teachers, the common theme for me is like instantaneous feedback. Like there's just something about both standing up in front of a room with people, you get the feedback right away, body language, silence, uncomfortable silence, all of those things, you are able to respond to your audience very quickly. And the data we collect in technology products really enables us to do the same thing. I'm not sure that the product developers are as good as teachers in many ways of being able to really respond to that feedback as quickly and as intuitively, but we try all the time. And that's really one thing that I got out of my last few years working really deep in user research around educational products, was the ability to like bring the feedback directly, loop it back into the product in a really authentic way, that you're absolutely responding quickly to the people who are using your stuff. And there's no better, that's your audience. Like that's really who you're making this for, not just, the salespeople or, whomever internally within your company might be reviewing it. Like you really become very focused on the authentic users, and teachers, they do that quite naturally and organically. So we all have a lot to learn. In fact, one of the, I actually was at a conference a year ago and I heard this really startling statistic, which is that only about 2% of ed tech companies do user research in the field, meaning that only a handful of companies who are making products that are being used in the classroom are actually going into classrooms and witnessing and observing and doing deeper qualitative research on how students are using these products and how teachers are using them to reach the goals that are set up for them. I was really surprised to hear that. And it really reminded me when I heard that of like what a great commitment like a company like BrainPOP or Sesame Workshop, places that I'd worked before, had really prioritized that. And certainly at BrainPOP, we've made it a huge priority to bring pretty much everybody who is working on a product into the classroom to see it being authentically used. And then, of course, following up with teachers and, taking a wider lens as well to teachers across the country. We can't get into every classroom outside of New York, but we can talk to teachers from all over. And I think just making a commitment to that is a really exceptional, it shouldn't be, but it's sort of an exceptional thing. And I think it makes a real difference in your product. More and more, I think teachers are when they use products, they can really feel if their own voice has been incorporated in, and it really responds to the pain points, to the goals that they've set for their own students. They can really tell if that's been considered in the creation of that product, the execution of it. And it's certainly something, I think my work with user research, one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that now that I'm working with entrepreneurs to start their companies, I'm really thinking about, well, a couple of things. Well, one, when I launched the fund, I was thinking about, I was interviewing women all the time, asking them like, what were their pain points around raising capital for their company? And really treating my fund like a product that was, was trying to solve a particular problem for women, getting the first money into their product. But it's also along the way, I think this is true for most investors, you find that it's not just the money that you can provide, but also strategic consulting in some way, like advising. And the user research piece has been something I think I've been able to offer to the entrepreneurs that I've worked with. Most of them are working in the education space, and I've been able to kind of pass that on a little bit, that this is a really valuable thing to invest in as a company, is talking to your customers and learning from them, and then using that information to teach back to them great ways to use the product.
Yeah, and you said something there that I'd like to follow up on, where you said that's just, to me, a intelligent way to view your fund as a product, because one, it draws even more on your own experience. As it seemed clear to me before, you have this very integrated approach to your work. But I'm also curious if you'd be open to sharing, what are some of those common pain points that you hear from entrepreneurs? You said predominantly or all women that you're going to work with for your fund. What are those pain points you hear about them trying to raise capital?
Well, I think this is something that's being addressed very head on in this moment in time, where you're seeing a lot of women raise investment funds, like raise, capital to start an investment fund specifically geared towards women entrepreneurs. So actually, right around the time when I got the opportunity to start this fund, Melinda Gates came out and announced that she's giving $1 billion to help close the gender gap around funding for entrepreneurs. And I was like, great. I was like, I'm in very good company. My checks will not be as large as Melinda Gates, I'm sure. But yes, I can guarantee, actually, they will not. But I'm so glad that not just, Melinda Gates, there's a whole group of women sort of colloquially called the Twitter Mafia, #angels, who have been funding women through syndicated angel investments for the last several years. And one of them has spun off her own fund called Moxie to raise $25 million to support women entrepreneurs. And I don't know exactly what their user research has shown, but mine has been that, women just, is really, really challenging to get in front of a panel of men and describe a product, whatever that product might be, that may not be for those men. It may be for an entirely different group of people. It may be for women specifically, or it may be for teachers, or it may be, in some of the cases of the products I'm looking at, for kids in schools. And it's a challenge. You have to develop a real bridge in your presentation to take people to a place where they understand what your product is going to do for a group of people that are not themselves. So, I think there's a little bit of an ease in talking to somebody like me who has been in the classroom, who has worked with students. There's a little bit of a shortcut lingo that you can use just to communicate the idea that solves a problem for a lot of women. The other thing is, well, there's just like a lot of people starting companies right now. So I just think that there's just a lot of challenges of getting yourself in front of a person who can really take some time and pay attention to you. So that's another pain point I'm trying to solve, is just be available and really develop the relationships with the entrepreneurs, as opposed to just thinking about all of these things as just deals on a docket of some sort. And then there's the really low bar of just calling people back, just answering an email. Apparently that's something that women have kind of unilaterally found to be challenging, just to feel very ignored by the investors that are out there. So I think if I can just be responsive, that's also like serving 2x what others are doing.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure for all parties, better for business ultimately too. All the things you're saying are just, being a better listener, being more empathetic, being a better communicator, all just, I think would just get better results too, not for yourself and for the entrepreneurs that you're working with.
I hope so. I also, I don't have a finance background, so that's I think traditionally thought of as a liability, but in many ways, I've always tried to work on something that comes from outside of an industry. So even while I've always worked in education, I've looked to other industries as models for ways that we could do it better in ours. Education has had this really lovely, I don't know if you would always call it lovely, but there's a kind of a lag in education behind other industries. And, if you play it right, that's actually like a nice runway where you can try a few things before feeling the pressure of like a consumer audience for something. It's a smaller playing field, but it's also, you have a little more time to develop ideas. And so just like as an educator, I've always looked to other industries to give me models for how to do something in the education space. Now, as an investor, I'm really looking to education as a model for the investor space. So I kind of like being that outsider.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you bring that up, because I was talking to my dad, and my dad worked for his career in the commodities industry, which I think is also kind of a little bit of its own isolated piece of the larger, I guess, investing industry. And the same thing, it's actually an advantage that educators and folks in the business of education have, where we can see what plays out in kind of other consumer or business to business sectors, and then apply it to education. So that's fascinating.
Exactly. Well said. Much better, more concisely said than I did, but that is exactly what I was getting at.
So,
and my dad was a little bit in the commodities markets too. Maybe that's a trend.
Interesting. I'm going to actually just go right into another question here to break things up and maybe get a laugh, to transition to another topic. Here's the question. Would the New York EdTech Meetup be the same without Mike Kleba and Sharia Huda? Which this was asked by Sharia. So maybe you can, just for listeners, explain that more or less inside joke, and then tell us a little bit about I'm curious just about basically lessons that you've learned from your work with running the Meetup.
I can say absolutely the Meetup would not be the same without Mike Kleba and Sharia Huda. They have made it very much what it is today. So the New York EdTech Meetup is a volunteer member organization. We, like I said at the top, we have almost 9,000 members. Now we grew over 1,000 members this year alone. It's the country's biggest EdTech meetup. And, we host events, we have an email list, we do a lot of networking between our members, sort of on demand. And then we've also hosted mentoring sessions, panel discussions, marketing workshops. We've done a lot of things, we tried a lot of different formats for our events. We have some really big plans for this year to even step up our membership value a little bit more, developing some premium content just for specific members of the meetup who want to engage with each other a little bit outside of the events. And we're really excited. We have a really close relationship with the South by Southwest EDU Festival. And actually on our next meetup is February 11th here in New York, and it will be co-hosted by South by Southwest EDU. So some of the programming team will come from Austin and get to interact with our New York community a little bit. And then in March, we'll be going to Austin to the festival and doing an event there. So we have a really nice like back and forth relationship with them. And essentially like the three of us, we're like, equal co-organizers. We just try to really balance our audience, balance the needs of our audience who are educators, entrepreneurs, and investors in the EdTech space. And so we're really responsive to our membership community. And I think we've cultivated a nice group of regulars, but also new people each time. The community is so welcoming and bringing in new people and really helping people transition between those roles that I mentioned. What we see really our role being is a way to help people move between entrepreneur, investor, educator, and be able to meet all the people operating in those spaces and be inspired by them and model themselves a little bit and find their mentors and their mentees in those spaces. So both Sharia and Mike have teaching backgrounds as well. So they're amazing in person, and they're so engaged with the community in person and online, and have really helped us like step up our events and our presence in the community. So no, it would not be the same without them for sure. I would not be able to keep it going just myself.
Well, yeah, and just, I've attended a bunch of the events, and now I'm here in my new house that's actually just about 10 minutes outside of Philly. So I used to live further up north, so I can't make it as often as I would like to, but
a little bit of a longer haul for you.
Yeah.
There's a Philly EdTech meetup too.
I know. I think I'll have to try to. Well, anyway, I don't think it's as active, but anyway, I'll probably cut that part out. But so I think the point that you mentioned that really resonates with me, and I'd like to highlight for anyone who's listening and is in the the greater New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania area, is the way that it's a group of people who have the general shared interest of education, technology, business, the intersection of all three, and are kind of free to discuss and, as you said, move between those roles almost in a really unique way. And just to explain to you, the conversations that I have on the podcast here, I've really modeled after the conversations I feel I could have at the meetup, because when you're around teachers, you don't always have the element of business or the technical aspects of EdTech. When you're around maybe, not that I'm in this circle, but if you're just around investors, of course, it's going to be this business focused conversation, but it's really cool to see just the way that the group really blends the three of them. Yeah. I've met other educators. I've interacted with people who became clients for the marketing work I do with EdTech companies, and I've had other members as guests on the podcast. So it's really, you're definitely right that it's a social group, but it's diverse, accepting, and really just beneficial for members.
One thing that we do at every meetup that has become not just our centerpiece, but really the way that we structure almost any event that we do, even outside of New York, is this idea of like, what do you have to offer the community? What do you need from the community? So we call it like, I needa, I gotta. And it's this really wonderful way to kind of introduce yourself to a big group of people at a networking event. But it also gives that aura of like, well, we're kind of all in this together, and what can I do for you? What can you do for me? Not in the transactional sense, but like, who are we as people, and, what can we contribute to each other? And the community has just really picked up on that and kind of run with it. And when it works just as well when we bring in other groups like South by Southwest or Start Ed, and Village Capital came a couple months ago. We've really been able to bring in very different communities to collaborate with us, and then do the same with the same technique, been able to integrate people all together very quickly. Because I think essentially people do want to introduce themselves and say who they are and what they can contribute, and also be open to what somebody else might offer them.
Mm-hmm. Right. I love that feature of the meetups, because it drops much of it's very honest. It drops some of the pretense that some other business socializing might have, where you say, I'm going to pretend to just be friendly, and then later try to work in my pitch. And this is, it's very honest. But anyway, so you've kind of touched on some points about what the community stands for and what it does. We have a little bit of time left here. Is 8:30 still a good time for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to ask a little bit about another question from a listener that relates to your new work with early stage investing. So this is from Pamela Gaudet, and she is curious about your opinion on EdTech valuations. So you get to, I'm sure, through the EdTech meetup, you have plenty of people who either talk to you or maybe even ask you about, how to go about getting investment. And then I'm sure you see maybe in sites like EdSurge and elsewhere some of the valuations of companies. So what's your opinion on the EdTech market? Pamela's wondering, is it a bubble? And if so, might it burst?
It's a really good question. And I mean, you're definitely speaking my new love language of valuations and bubbles. And this is definitely the vocabulary, the lingo that I'm learning now. I have all my EdTech jargon that I can leave to the side. And now I have all new financial jargon that I get to talk. But I think essentially my rock bottom opinion is that education is a slow growth business. I mean, it's about people, it's about learning, it's about kids. These are not things that are like hockey stick growth graphs that you might throw into a PowerPoint when you're pitching to investors. So, I mean, that's my take on it. I always try to remember that when a group of people are talking about eyeballs on a piece of technology, I'm thinking these are 10-year-old children that we're talking about. They're not just eyeballs. So, and as we spoke about before, like one of the great things about education is that you have like a long runway, where you might see things that might work in the consumer space and adapt them for education. And I think that some of the even financial modeling that's going on around different ways that companies are funded these days, like it will be adapted down for the education space as well. And in terms of bubble, I mean, one great thing also is that, people need to go to school and they need to, learning will be happening. And there's only more and more opportunity for that throughout our lives. One thing that is absolutely true is that people have begun to value the lifelong learning trajectory in a way that they never did before. Sometimes it's very practical, like they need to learn new skills in order to do new kinds of jobs. Sometimes it's because we're living longer, and we just like this podcast accepted, but you can't just listen to podcasts your whole life. Like there's other things that other ways to learn and other modalities that need to be stimulated throughout your life. And these are great opportunities for educators. I mean, I actually believe very strongly that really just like almost every company today is a technology company in the sense that it incorporates some technology to do its work. I think every company will be an education company. Like every company will need to learn from the people using their products and teach back to them, what they think are the best uses of it and sort of like the optimal execution of what they're putting out there for use. And so I think that in some ways, like all of these experiments around different kinds of education companies, even with their crazy valuations and, $50 million Series B and all of that, what we're really doing is creating a sense of value of the education process that will be fed back into all companies going forward, and programs and organizations and practices and governments and all of that. So, one thing that teachers are always bemoaning, especially in the US, teachers are always bemoaning that, their work isn't valued maybe the way it is in other countries like Finland, or, a lot of other European countries are held up as the model for how much more valued teachers are, not financially, but just, the work that they do. And, one potential and I hope probable outcome of the growth of some of these education companies is like that value will be, sort of acknowledged by consumers going forward.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. It's perhaps a positive and productive perspective on this topic is that it is great to see focus and investment going towards education as opposed to another, Uber for pancakes or whatever the
right
app might be.
Exactly.
So.
But one thing that I am seeing in terms of like Uber for pancakes is that there are some really interesting projects, consumer brands that are being created around video and delivery of video-based content, whether that's like fitness related stuff or, it's just like, there's just like a sort of expectation and familiarity with learning through video that's going on that's really exciting. And that could, I think, have a circle round effect to more traditional education as well. And I just think people are just valuing like learning new things at a greater pace, a faster pace. So I guess that makes me a little bullish on valuations. But I mean, I do think the numbers themselves seem crazy, but if they're attached to value in a greater sense, then I'm all in favor.
Yeah. Pamela, I think you got a very insightful and detailed answer. I agree. And if we think about the way the speed at which technology has been adopted in schools, and then, for example, something I like to point to is just the proliferation of devices, where now I'm sure there's some numbers that could challenge this, but devices are really not as much of the issue as much as, properly using them and making sure education is equitable in other areas as opposed to just getting access to the devices. But so anyway, you have time for maybe two kind of rapid fire questions here from some other.
I will also try to be fast then on my answers. I know I've been sort of speaking quite a bit.
Oh no, that's fine. Like my judgment of classes that I teach, I'd much rather have the talkative class than the silent class. There's
I know. Listen to other people's voices instead of your own.
So this was a good kind of paired question. You could take it however you'd like. It's from Daniel Adeyanju on LinkedIn. And he said, what is not working in EdTech? Where is a lot of money being spent with little to show for it? And conversely, I guess, what are the underaddressed needs in education that EdTech could help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing that I've been talking to a lot of different constituents about is, many schools are experiencing the situation where they've actually bought too much technology and it's not being used and they don't know what to do with it. And there's a few different solutions to that, like helpful things like different, ratings platforms where, you can learn a little bit more about how other teachers are using the product before you buy it, like those kinds of things. Learn Platform is one of them. But I think essentially what it comes down to is that, there's going to be a kind of weeding out, what I've been calling like the sort of Marie Kondoing of ed tech in schools. And people are going to really look at each one and be like, does this spark joy in my classroom? And the more that teachers are involved with that process, the better. And, one thing that is not always acknowledged is the true power that teachers have in the decision-making process for purchasing ed tech and then of course using it. And so the more you get your teachers involved in the purchasing part, the more likely it is that they're going to use it. They're going to recommend things that they indeed want to be using. So listening to those, early adopter teachers, those champions of new technologies, listening to the mainstream classroom teacher who, has been doing some professional development on her own and wants to try something new. I think that that's kind of, it's oversubscribing to a lot of things is a problem, and that teachers are the solution to that problem, really listening to them. Unaddressed issues in education. I mean, there's so many. And one thing that I actually, as an investor new to this, new investor to a space that I've been working in a lot, is I've had to develop a pretty narrow investment thesis. What are the kinds of projects that I'm going to be funding? And one thing a really hard decision that I made early on was that I'm really interested in looking at what's the future of education. You probably could tell from a lot of the things that I said today, I'm like an optimist, and I'm trying to think 20 years ahead into what are going to be the interesting ways that people are using technology in general, and how is that going to apply back to the education space. And then one thing that I spend a little less time on is thinking about how to solve current problems. So I don't consider myself an expert on like what are the solutions to the current problems, but I do acknowledge they are many and deep. And true equity, as you mentioned before, like equity around the availability of technology and the availability of quality products for all people is, I think, one of the most pressing issues. And it's not about, as we used to call it, like the digital divide, like that some people have and some people have not. It's really about quality and implementation of those products. So again, getting teachers involved, because like they're really the ones who know the students the best, and having them really involved with making those decisions. I think if there's actually less technology in a school, it will be used more equitably.
That's
radical, right?
Oh yeah. But I think it's a good point, right? Instead of just defaulting to here, what app do we have to occupy kids for this 50-minute period, it's more intentional.
Yeah, more intentional. Yeah. That's my 2020 outlook, intentionality.
Cool. Yeah. Good points there. Okay, so last question here from Maria Jernigan. And this is echoing a little bit back to your thoughts on differences between the education market and other investment markets, but what advice do you have for startups in navigating the long procurement process in public schools?
I can't take any credit for this, but we actually hosted a marketing workshop a few months ago with the New York EdTech Meetup, and we had a fantastic woman who had actually worked in a superintendent's office here in New York, I believe in Long Island, for many years, and she kind of summed it up the best. She was like, relationship. In the US, almost across, in any state that you're working in, any district, it's really a case-by-case basis for getting into the system. Her advice on this panel, I believe her name was Joanne, her advice was, develop these relationships. And for every district that you want to target, basically do your user research. Find a person in the district who will talk to you and tell you what their procurement process is like, and tailor your sales tactics to that. That's a real challenge for like a 1 or 2 person team, obviously. But, I think we are coming to an age where you can do a lot of that relationship building digitally, by having great materials that are available on demand, and having follow-ups, either by email or video calls. Like, I think it can be done in a way that is a little more scalable than it used to be, that many of the districts and superintendent's offices are very responsive to digital marketing materials at this point. Mm-hmm. But it is still really about developing relationships and, developing your success stories and your case studies and, trying to leverage those into new places where people are using your product. The other way, that's kind of the top-down way, but the other way is, again, just, really targeting teachers individually. Some of the most successful EdTech companies I've seen and worked with were basically sold word of mouth, teacher to teacher. One thing that has been a constant across my career working with teachers is that teachers learn from other teachers. They trust them, they listen to them, they go to them for advice, they want to know what they're using in their classroom. Teachers, like almost to a one, are just so great at looking at what one teacher is doing and then modifying it for their own classroom, their own students, their own population, like their own, little eccentricities. Teachers are just great at like adapting and putting it into practice in their own space. So, if you can activate that teacher network, that's a really great way to build brand awareness and to get the attention of the districts and the superintendents. Just one company that I was just talking to the other day, who's raising a seed round right now, they're actually already generating quite a bit of revenue, and it's all inbound. Like, they're actually not going out and soliciting to districts. They've just built a really strong teacher network, and teachers are just selling it up the chain. They want it. They want to take it from the freemium version to the pro version. They want to take it from the pro version to the, district level version. They're basically the ones who are selling it up the chain. So if you can activate that teacher network, they have the relationship already with the district, just by being, an employee. And so that's who really decision makers are listening to.
Yeah. So Maria, no quick hack, but lots of,
right.
lots of, thoughtful strategy for long-term planning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, I appreciate you, and I hope everyone on LinkedIn there with those questions. I think we got to everybody. Yeah. I'm sure they'll appreciate you taking the time to answer their questions too. So this has been fascinating conversation. And I know I learned a lot. We didn't even get to really everything, since there's a whole other part of your bio that I'd love to talk about maybe at another time, which is,
I was going to say we should do just a whole podcast just on parenting in the digital age. I have a whole, like, another hat that I could put on and talk about that for another hour easily. It's a real passion of mine to work directly with parents and help them, figure out, how I think we know that our children are having a very different childhood than we had ourselves. And so there's some tough challenges that come up, and just helping them navigate it is a real love of mine.
Yeah, it's an interest of mine too. My kids are 4 and 2, so I'm trying to figure this all out. So maybe, we have a part 2.
Definitely
works at some part.
Well, I can give you the 14-year. Now I have a 14-year-old and a 9-year-old. So I'm a little ahead of you, and can give you a little preview of what's to come. Incredibly scary.
I'm envisioning even maybe in the future it could be you and maybe a entrepreneur or two that you've invested in, all talking together. So, but anyway, I really appreciate you coming on the show. And at the end, I like to kind of open it up to you to make a suggestion, a request, ask a question, whatever you'd like as a kind of final call to action for listeners.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe I'll do something around the parenting piece, which is that one thing that I always tell parents as they, and the same goes for teachers, I think, that are working in this space, is have a lot of compassion for yourself. We are, just as our children and our students are the first ones who are using some of these technologies for learning, we're the first generation of teachers and parents who are teaching in this time as well. And, being a role model and being a kind of guide on the side for these kids as they go through some really interesting, like radical changes in our society and the way culture is developing, it's tough work. So I have a lot of compassion for the people I see doing that work, and I just want people to have compassion for themselves too.
All right, certainly a nice note to leave on. So one more thing, maybe you mentioned before, if folks want to reach out or get in touch with you, what's the best way for that?
Well, you can always find me on LinkedIn, and then you can also see all the questions that people had for our podcast tonight. And yeah, so that's really the best way to reach me is through LinkedIn. I'm just Jessica Millstone on LinkedIn. And if you want to see me on Twitter, most of my stuff on Twitter historically has been around games and learning. So you can see kind of like the history of my thinking on that. I'm at J_Millstone.
Great. All right. Well, again, thanks very much for coming on the show, Jessica. My name is Gerard Dawson, and this has been another episode of the EdTech Startup Show.